Our final session of the day is a bird's eye view. How is the Western City and its Aerotropolis shaping up? So I'd like to introduce our panel. If they'd like to start making their way towards the stage, that would be terrific. First panellist is Roch, the Managing Director of Sydney Water. We also have Rod Howard, Deputy CEO of Endeavour Energy. Graham Millett, Chief Executive Officer of the Western Sydney Airport. Sam Sangster, CEO of the Western City and Aerotropolis Authority, and the panel will be moderated by Justine Kinch, who's the Group Director for Building and Places at AECOM. So please make them welcome.
Great, thank you and welcome everybody to the final session of the afternoon. I'm sure it's been a fantastic day. We are on the home stretch. Before I start, I would like to just acknowledge that Liz Dibbs, our Western City Director for the Greater Sydney Commission, is here. Liz, thank you for attending this afternoon. So we're here to talk about the Western City Parkland, including the airport and the Aerotropolis. So I might just kick off and get straight into it. So Graham, I'm going to start with you.
Yes, by all means.
You've just announced the winning design for your new terminal at Western Sydney Airport, and you are nestled in the middle of the Parkland city. Can you just tell us what we should expect to see when we arrive at Nancy Bird Walton Airport, and how we're going to know we're in the Western Parkland city?
Well, I think you can expect to see a pretty spectacular airport. After the process that we went through, we had 44 submissions from around the world, and we narrowed that down to 15, then we narrowed it down to 5, and then we had the very difficult task of selecting from 3 finalists. One of the criteria that we set for the architects was that they had to reflect in their submissions a sense of place. A sense of place being Western Sydney. So we didn't want an opera house in the middle of Western Sydney. The opera house is just fine where it is, the sails, the harbour, etc. It's entirely appropriate, but inappropriate in a different setting. So we commissioned the architects with that criterion very much in mind. And with the fly-through that we have on the web, what you'll notice is that they've taken the undulation in the mountains as the inspiration for their design. We've looked around the world at how other airports have worked into their design a sense of place to learn from that. So you'll see the colours of Western Sydney reflected in the colours of the airport itself. You'll see the timbers will reflect the local timbers. We'll be using as much local material as we possibly can. So people will know they're in Western Sydney because of some of the digital displays, for example. They will highlight the beauty of the region, whether it's the Blue Mountains or whether it's the Illawarra, and we think of the Illawarra as part of the West. They might not, but we do. Way up past St Mary's into the Hawkesbury area. So I think all of those different elements will be reflected predominantly in the terminal design. It will be a 21st century terminal. It will have the latest technology. We're aiming to have it as a terminal which is the epitome of the customer experience that you can see in some airports around the world. Changi as an example, the efficiency with which you can get into the airport, the efficiency with which you can get out of the airport, and the efficiency of being inside the terminal itself, so that the time from curb to gate is minimised, because we're planning for it to be a destination as well as an aviation hub. So people will want to come there because it has other attributes. When I say other attributes that aren't necessarily associated directly with aviation. So you'll certainly know you're in Western Sydney and not in the Eastern Harbour City or the Central River City. That's a key criterion for us.
Fantastic, I'm excited about that. So I'm sure the airport and the Aerotropolis is going to be full of trees and green, and we've heard earlier today from Rob Stokes about the importance of cooling Western Sydney. So perhaps over to you, Roch. To deliver what is truly Parkland City, it needs to be underpinned by a fair amount of water. Can you tell us how Sydney Water is thinking about meeting the needs of this new Parkland City to ensure that it is livable?
Yeah, and I think it's a really important point that we think about water not just as drinking water or wastewater. But Western Sydney is actually a fantastic opportunity to think about water as an integrated water cycle rather than just water pipe and wastewater pipe. When you think about how we can make a city livable with water, there are really plenty of opportunities to make it happen. The trees is an obvious one. You need water for the trees. But if you think about a very livable environment, a green environment that is easy to live in and pleasant to live in, then you start thinking about having small lakes, small rivers, water feature, having the water will make the environment nice and will make the environment livable. So the way we very much look at Western Sydney, and we work with our partners because water is only one of the pieces of the jigsaw, and it has to be integrated into everything. But the way we look at it is very much about using water as one water. So not thinking about drinking water on one side, wastewater on the other side, but thinking about the entire water cycle, which is drinking water, recycled water, wastewater, storm water, the water that you will find in the water features, the water that will be necessary for industries to set up their business in the Aerotropolis. All the waters, the different waters that are existing around our cities, but are usually designed in many different waters. We want to think about it as one water.
That sounds essential for Western Sydney, but can you tell us how you'd go about doing that?
Well, there is a lot of work that has been ongoing during the last few months, or a bit longer than this, actually. So we've been working very collaboratively with different teams, with Sam's teams, with Graham's teams, with Roch's teams as well, because we're thinking about that in, as I said, as one of the pieces of the jigsaw. It's a complex jigsaw, as we've said. Water has definitely an essential part to play, but not on its own. So we are here as a team player to have water to contribute to the success.
Great. And Rod, what about you? How does a utility provider participate in the Parkland city? How do you think about your role in that?
I'd sort of put it down to three words, sort of sustainability, innovation, collaboration. We're the electricity provider for Western Sydney. So how do you actually come up with sort of energy solutions that are sustainable, and sustainable both in a physical sense but also in an efficiency sense? For example, how do we actually work together with other utility providers, Sydney Water, gas, telcos, to come up with sort of integrated corridors so that we can actually make more effective use of the available sort of land space. From an innovation point of view, is the world that when I first started in industry, where electricity flowed one way, it's very much different these days. It all flows both ways, and it's all about choice and giving customers choice and giving developers choice on how they actually want to meet their energy needs. Is it distributed generation? Is it microgrids? Is it batteries? And our role in life is to facilitate that, to enable that, and then how do you actually make that two-way flow work in a sustainable way? So I come back to the three words of sustainability, innovation, and collaboration.
Great. And Sam, you're at the genesis of creating the place where people are going to live, work and play out there in Western Sydney. Early days yet, but what's your role in the Parkland city?
Look, our role is to really pick up on all the work that's been discussed now in terms of the airport being built, all the infrastructure and utilities work that's being done, and capitalise on the $20 billion worth of investment from federal and state governments, and then really deliver on those other 38 commitments under the city deal to actually make the West a place that we're incredibly proud of, and ensure that we are doing all we can to ensure that we actually achieve economic growth in the West, which is already the third largest economy in Australia, but we actually want to take it to a whole new level and ensure that actually we have more jobs in the West than stopping people having to get in their car and leave the West for the East for their jobs. You know, we know there's only about 15% of Sydney jobs in the Western Parkland city right now, and about half the population lives west of Parramatta, so we need to address that imbalance.
And is there one thing you must not do?
I think there's probably two things we must not do, and the most critical of those, and you know, Graham's task to attract airlines is going to be incredibly difficult if we allow a curfew to happen. And so as we develop this, there's absolutely an imperative from everybody in the West to ensure that we do not impede the 24-hour operation of this airport. To do so would be absolute madness. Those of you who were here last night, Lakshmi said last night, the other thing we mustn't stop doing is we mustn't stop dreaming and we mustn't stop delivering. And that was a beautiful sentiment, and I think that's incredibly important. We keep that level of dreams and aspirations very, very high, and that we also then deliver on those dreams.
And in terms of the jobs then, Sam, that you're hoping to achieve out there at the Aerotropolis, how is the government ensuring that there is fair competition right through Western Sydney in terms of industry attraction?
Look, it's an interesting question that we do get from time to time. I think if you look at innovation districts, and you can call this an innovation district in some ways, there's not an innovation district anywhere in the world where government actually hasn't had some level of intervention. The trick, and I've said this publicly a few times, the trick is actually also then knowing for government at what point to actually get out of the way of industry. Government in this occasion, through the city deal, is investing billions and billions of dollars, and so it's entirely appropriate that government ensures then that we actually ensure the economic returns are now delivered for the community off the back of that. Our approach around industry attraction is absolutely about bringing those cornerstone investors to actually come and bring in what they are bringing new to Sydney, new to New South Wales, new to Australia in many cases. These are the growth pieces of these businesses. They're not taking businesses from other part of Western Sydney. That simply doesn't wash. That's actually not what we're about here. We need to ensure that underpinning the work we're doing, where's the next 2% of GDP growth coming from Australia, and what are the industries? And last week, the New South Wales Treasurer released the economic blueprint and outlined a number of growth industries. And if you look at the growth industries that are included, they are exactly the industries that we're looking to attract into the Aerotropolis, that are the new things that actually take us away from a reliance on minerals extraction and some of the other things that we do very, very well right now, and we shouldn't stop doing them. But how do we actually get to 3.8 or 4% growth as a country to actually ensure we get wages growth and an underpinning of the economy? And so our role is very much around actually how do we bring the right businesses in. There are some things that government can do that others just simply can't, and our role is to ensure we do those things and actually then get out of the way. And I think the last piece is when you look across a landmass the size of Adelaide, and even the Aerotropolis, 11,000 odd hectares, the amount of land we control is about 114 hectares, and if you actually look at that in terms of net developable area, it's about 70 or 80 hectares. So the reality is we're not going to actually have everybody doing everything in that environment. So we will have landowners in the room. There's plenty of opportunities for everybody to attract incredible talent and incredible businesses to the west.
And Roch, what's Sydney Water's role in helping Sam attract the right industry, ensuring we've got the right type of water for these new industries?
So there's probably two aspects. One of them is making the city livable with water, so that people not only love to come working, but actually love living in the area, which is important. The second aspect is very much about making available the quality of water that is expected by the different businesses, and different businesses will expect different quality of water. The technology is existing, so actually it's not very difficult to produce different quality of water that is exactly fit for the purpose that industries require. So that's something that should be available, because if it's a cheap factory, for example, they will be willing to have ultra pure water, very, very high quality. Now, if it's an agribusiness, they will use a different quality of water that is cheaper to produce. And we need to have the two available so that any industry that would like to come can come. The sustainability aspect is absolutely critical because no industry will be willing to set up in Western Sydney if the security of water is not ensured. So looking at the sustainability aspect, in a sense, water security is absolutely critical. And we need to be able to offer a full water security to the people, not only in Western Sydney, actually in the entire Sydney area.
It's topical at the moment. Yes. Graham, I might just ask you a question back onto the airport. With all the investment we see leveraging off the airport in terms of transport infrastructure, what else do we need to be doing in Western Sydney to truly optimise the investment in the airport?
Well, I think importantly the infrastructure is going to be critical for the airport, for the Aerotropolis and for development generally. What that means is that we have to have the right sort of roads. The M12 is a good start, the widening of Elizabeth Drive, the work that's being done on the Northern Road, they're all essential. Together with the rail infrastructure, the north-south rail line, which has been approved by the federal government, the state government in terms of funding, and a business case for that I think will be completed in the very short term. And then later on other rail lines which would extend down to Campbelltown, for example, and potentially sometime in the future a rail line that would link Western Sydney Airport with Parramatta and link up with the Metro West project. So I think road and rail are very important. Of course, Roch's told you about water. That's essential in what is a relatively dry region of Australia, both in terms of the reticulation of the water, in terms of the treatment of the water. A lot of Western Sydney doesn't have proper sanitation, and so sewage is important, and the treatment of that in an appropriate kind of way. But I think also it needs the right infrastructure for energy and the right infrastructure in terms of communications. So if you want to see the Western Parkland city be a true 21st century city, then it's going to need at least 5G by the time we open in 2026. And potentially by then its successor, which I'll call 6G for argument's sake. We need to make sure that the entire region is covered by that sort of technology. For example, the airport will certainly have 5G and perhaps 6G by 2026. But if you don't have a wider network in the region of 5G, then you can't run an autonomous vehicle network. We're planning to have autonomous vehicles airside, we're planning to have autonomous vehicles landside on the airport. But what happens when they get outside the gate? If there's no 5G, they simply don't work. So all of that infrastructure is important. And I think a little bit of the field of dreams mentality needs to be thought about here too, and that is if you build it, they will come. I think if people can see that the infrastructure's there, that the jobs are there, then they'll want to live in the region. They'll want that 30-minute city concept, which we're all desired in terms of having. So infrastructure is going to be critical, but having it in the right place at the right time is the real skill here for all of us. And that's a real challenge, because for us the airport is a single project and it's reasonably well contained. When you think about roads and rail and water and energy and what have you, this is one project of many projects that they would otherwise have on their books, and so they can only pay so much attention to it. But it's vital for Western Sydney that we do pay the right amount of attention to that infrastructure development.
Fantastic answer. And Rod, how's Endeavour Energy thinking about Graham's challenge and his autonomous vehicles causing a traffic jam on the Northern Road?
I might start by sort of giving some context. In a traditional sense, we sort of design and build our electricity networks to cater for the peak demand. Peak demand normally occurs on a summer's afternoon, usually 40 degree plus in Western Sydney, where it's only 30 in the city, and everybody wants to come home and turn their air conditioning on. That's been the traditional challenge we've had, with the real pressure on affordability. And pressure from our regulator to say, well, is there a more effective way of doing this at a lower cost? And we've also seen in the growth of renewables, PVs and whatever, We've probably got about 16, 17% of our customer base now has their own sort of solar panels on their roofs. That's been great in terms of solving or mitigating their affordability issue from an energy point of view. But really, as all that's done is deferred the peak from a traditional sort of 3 p.m. in the afternoon to probably 5, 6, 7 o'clock at night. So it really hasn't solved the peak issue. The solution, and that's why I came back to the sort of innovation, is that with the growth of renewables, and particularly as sort of battery costs come down, that'll be the ultimate solution on how do you actually really manage that two-way flow of energy and have it flowing in such a way at a certain time of day to minimise that investment and therefore make it more affordable to the people of Western Sydney. We're sort of about to embark on a pilot project, albeit not in Western Sydney, but on the far south coast of our supply area, down a place called Baldy Point, which for most times of the year is a very low user of energy. But of course, on the holiday periods, it skyrockets and almost goes twice, 3 times the load. And so we're working, with the community, with the retailers, with technology providers. How can you actually put a solution in that allows you at those peak times to actually have ultimate control of the use of people's batteries or the community battery to supply those peak demands, where at other times there's it becomes a different issue, and how do you actually provide the pricing incentives to customers to want to participate in that process? That's the model of tomorrow, and examples of that have been rolled out in places overseas. But to me, that's part of the solution here. Go forward 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, you'll see more of that, where our business will go from just building poles and wires or cables and transformers to actually having smarts in our systems to actually control that balancing between renewables and drawing down from the grid in order to meet peak to load and minimise, you'll never eliminate, but minimise the level of investment, which in turn has an impact on affordability. So it's a very complex problem, but that's the challenge that we now have in front of us.
And do you think there's application for that type of pilot project in terms of managing peak in areas of Western Sydney?
For sure. And we've got certain players who've been knocking at our door in Western Sydney, looking at ways of how can we in fact use renewables as part of the solution, and obviously that's still in very early discussions at this point of time.
Great. I forgot to mention that it's okay to ask questions from the floor. I have got a couple that have been handed to me, so if you don't mind, I'm just going to read out a couple. The first one, we were talking about this just before the panel session, so you should be well prepped, Graham. How attractive will it be for customers to get off a long-haul flight and then face lengthy ground transportation trips to their destination? How is WSA approaching this?
Well, once again, the issue is around the ability of the infrastructure to provide rapid transport. So we're looking at rapid bus transfers from the airport. The metro, of course, will play a role. That's assuming that people want to get out of the airport. There'll be some people who want to stay in the region, so we're planning on having hotels nearby. I would expect that the tourist industry would also be looking at hotels. We'd like to think that Western Sydney is a destination in its own right for tourists. We have the mountains, for example. We're between the mountains, the Jenolan Caves, and the Eastern Harbour City. So it's a pretty good location in any respect. We'd like people to be able to move around as freely as possible. I think a lot of planning has gone into anticipating demand. Certainly there's going to be a lot of growth in the region. Sydney's majority of that growth will come in the Western Corridor. And the planning accordingly is that we start off with infrastructure that's expandable. So we start off with an M12 that's 2 lanes either way and can grow to 3 lanes either way. Elizabeth Drive will grow to 2 lanes both ways and then to 3 lanes both ways. So I think we're planning with the state government, federal government, state government and the councils to ensure that we don't experience the type of congestion that we currently experience in other parts of this great city.
Justine, I might just add, as a resident of Western Sydney for more than 50 years, I think I'd rather come from Western Sydney Airport than have to travel into Kingsford Smith.
I tend to agree with you, Rod. Just one quick one for Sam as well. Sam, are the Aerotropolis tenants and target companies demanding sustainable circular economy utilities that everyone is talking about? Do we need to up our game?
Short answer is yes, and that's why we're working with people like Roch and his team and the Endeavour team. People often ask me what keeps me awake at night, and actually utilities is the piece that I think we know is the piece that's keeping us all awake at night. And it's about ensuring that we're actually delivering the right infrastructure at the right times that actually allows development to occur unimpeded. And, we know there's at least one landowner in the room that's had a rezoning for 3.5 years and is only just getting those utilities to their boundary now. We need to actually ensure that as a system that we actually have those things, and Jim was here talking about that before. We actually need to make sure that that whole regulatory framework and all the other things that we have that ordinarily slow that down are taken out of the way. And the other piece is actually not a negative, it's a positive around that, and Roch talked about it before. We very carefully have planned an agribusiness precinct because we can actually then use nutrient-rich wastewater, one of the forms of water, as an input. And so we actually are not just looking at one type of water and one type of industry. We actually are thinking about the complementary uses we can make to ensure we do get that circular economy, and that does come in the industry selection as well. So it's not an accident. Short answer, we must build a circular economy. We must have sustainable utilities. And the other piece about it, there's two other pieces that are really important. One, they have to be affordable. So there's no point actually having rolled gold solutions that no one can actually afford to run. And the second piece is actually the insurance industry. I don't know if there's anybody here from the insurance sector, but the insurance sector is beginning to look at this with great interest. And actually one of the things we're working with two of the largest insurers globally at the moment, because they're actually starting to understand that actually climate resilient locations will actually earn a premium discount over other areas that are not climate resilient. And so we're very focused about a total cost of ownership picture for our tenants and the people that come and invest in Western Sydney. And we need to ensure that we actually have a climate resilient environment, because that will lower premiums, and we know insurance is also only going one way. And if we're out talking to the CFOs in an organisation, part of our pitch is we're actually thinking about those things, because global companies are miles ahead of Australian companies on this issue right now.
Yeah, fascinating. And Roch, would you like to just talk a little bit maybe to Sam's point about the water waste energy nexus?
Yeah, I think that goes exactly with what Sam was saying. When you think about circular economy, when you think about sustainability, then there is an obvious nexus between energy and water. Water is using energy, but actually with water and the byproduct of the treatment processes, you're producing things that are extremely useful for energy generation. So there is an obvious nexus between energy and water, but there's another one which is between energy, waste, and water, which is another one, and that's why Sam was talking about the concept of multi-utility makes a lot of sense, especially when you're developing an area like Western Sydney and starting from a blank sheet of paper. So multi-utility and circular economy are two concepts that will go together very well.
And we know you're doing some amazing things already with the people at UNSW, the graphene. Does anybody know about graphene? If you don't know about graphene, go and Google graphene. Sydney Water's doing a pilot at the Nepean treatment plant with a graphene filter that actually extracts methane that actually then can be used for power generation. First place in the world. So Sydney Water's doing some pretty amazing world-leading things. For us, that's fascinating, because we'd actually then love to have the manufacturing capability that could manufacture those on an industrial scale. And so this is where what we're doing in the West is actually really fascinating, that we then, through our partners, we can actually even think about how we actually take that sort of technology that's the absolute bleeding edge globally and actually begin to build industries around that. One of the real challenges around graphene right now is actually how do you get it to industrial scale production. Lots of research applications such as that's happening in Nepean, but actually how do you take that filter and actually make it industry? We're really excited about those opportunities, and our partners that are engaged in this process want to come and play, and the universities play a critical part in that.
Excuse me, I've got a very important question to Mr. Millett. How are they going to get the aircraft fuel out to the airport, Badgerys Creek Airport? By a truck or a pipeline or what? Aircraft fuel.
Graham, are you okay to go for that one?
Yeah, I'm fine to answer that question. So a number of airports in Australia are already truck fuel, if you look at Gold Coast, if you look at Canberra or Adelaide. So it's not an unusual practice in Australia or an unusual practice around the world. At the moment, it would appear that demand when we open and for a few years after that is probably insufficient to justify a pipeline on economic grounds. Having said that, however, there's quite a bit of work being done at the moment in discussions with the private sector, the federal government, and also with the state government to look at the possibilities. Clearly, the state government is responsible for the corridors. Then there's the issue of who funds the building. But for us, the plan at the moment is to open with trucked fuel. The number of trucks is actually relatively small. If you look at B doubles, we're probably talking about 6 or 7 or maybe 8 a day. The demand will not be great, and one of the reasons for that is domestic aircraft tend to double carry fuel, so they will often fill up somewhere else and fly to Western Sydney and then fly out again without refuelling. It's not true of long-haul international flights though. When they come in, their tanks are usually relatively low, and so they would need to refuel. But probably for the first 5 or 6 years of the airport's life, I would expect on current plans that we would be trucking fuel.
Thank you. Maybe a quick question this is a last question from the floor. How much work has been done on planning for utility easements in the Western City? So maybe Rod and Roch, whether you've got some thoughts on that?
In terms of Endeavour Energy, we've sort of done our master planning of what the ultimate solution will look like from a major infrastructure point of view. We are working sort of closely with other utility partners. In fact, we've got an MOU between utility partners so that we can ensure that we can make maximum use of corridors, because some corridors will be very tight. So, for example, Elizabeth Drive is a corridor that needs to be carefully planned and work very closely with all other providers. But under our master planning model, the objective, of course, is to take opportunities as they present themselves. So, for example, there's a lot of work in terms of rebuilding the Northern Road, and so as part of that work, we in fact are installing our pipes, our cable pipes or ducts under the road, so that even though we don't need the cables at this point in time, that facility is there to be had, so we don't have to dig up the roads again. So that's probably my response.
Yeah, so we've been coordinating a group of utilities, and so including Roch utility, electricity, but also gas, the whole objective of this is to make the best use of the lands, because land will be best used at something else than just having utilities under. So there is a working group that has been starting to work actually almost 12 months ago on the planning of the utility corridors.
And Roch, is it true to say that we should expect the South Creek corridor to be one of these collaborative corridors with utilities and recreation and cycleways and? I think Jim mentioned that before. There is a lot of cooperation and a lot of people working together. The South Creek corridor is one of the corridors. It's not the only one, but really the objective of everyone is to make the best use of the land. So that includes working together, because if we don't, then we will not be successful. And on the theme of working together, much of the conversation around the development of Western Sydney raises some pretty challenging questions around managing heat, air quality, public health and general prosperity. Can any of you tell us a little bit about how we're taking the community along this journey to ensure that they're hopeful of an optimistic future in Western Sydney?
You want to take that?
Let me start? Yeah, I'll start there if you like. Look, I think there's an enormous amount that's being done, and you must not underestimate the amount of work that actually our 8 local government area champions have actually been doing in that regard already. To say we have a highly engaged community in the West would be an understatement. The amount of community forums that are run, there's an overarching theme that comes through most of that though, which is actually just get on with it, which is actually which is actually kind of nice. One of the challenges we all have is actually community engagement now. You know, on a state government perspective, there's actually 28 state government agencies currently doing something in the Western Parkland city. Then you add the Endeavour Energies, then you add all the work that has been done with the community group that is being done by Graham and his team. There's actually almost over-communication now going on. So it's actually one of the interesting challenges. The community is actually saying, thanks, we've had enough engagement, can you just get on with some stuff? So it's a really interesting balancing act all the time with community here. In terms of the aspiration, though, make no bones about it, there is an incredible aspiration about making this the opportunity that we all really want in the West. And so that is actually a Bunsen burner that continues to be applied to all of us every day as we're out and about. And I think it's incumbent on the leadership that we continue to talk about community, because we're doing it for community. This is not just pouring concrete and building things. This is actually for our community. There's already 1 million people live in the Western Parkland city. We actually have a lot of people to talk to already. We talk about growth all the time. There's actually 1 million people already live here, and we need to be really clear.
Anybody else want to comment?
Oh, I'd just say that I very much support Sam's comments. We've found that there's a very high degree of community support for the airport. Now typically airports don't necessarily attract positive comment, but we're finding quite the opposite. And when I speak to Probus clubs, Rotary clubs, etc., the realisation is that the airport's going to happen. That's the bottom line. When I speak to local councils, the realisation is the airport's going to happen. So the fight to stop the airport is over. The question now for the communities is, how do they extract the maximum benefit from the airport, the Aerotropolis, the infrastructure that's being put in place, not just for themselves, but for their children and for their grandchildren, for generations not yet born. That's what we're really building here. We're building a 21st century and a 22nd century city. And I think the local community now have tweaked to that. They understand that's what we're trying to do. So we see very little opposition to the airport. We see very little opposition to the development of the region, because people now understand that they can live, work and play in an area that is geographically concise. It's within 30 minutes. Everything that they need is within 30 minutes. They don't have to pack up for an hour and a half drive to the east and then drive back again. So I think there is not just the realisation that this development's going to happen. I think now there's a real expectation that that's going to happen, and that's the job of the people at this table and also many others out there.
Great. Now, I am conscious that we are over time, but maybe, Graham, just the final question for you. What is the question that you're most tired of answering about the airport? And would you like to answer it now and get it over and done with?
Tired of answering. Well, I can tell you the question they get asked most often, which I always have to answer in the same way. People say, tell us what the flight paths are. They say, we know that you know what the flight paths are, so tell us what the flight paths are. And I have to say to them that airports typically don't get involved in flight paths, to be quite frank with you. This is an activity that's being run by the Commonwealth out of Canberra, as it always has been. And I suspect in my lifetime always will be. So there are no flight paths at the moment. I can say that with absolute certainty. But there is a lot of work going on. I expect it will be quite some time before the flight paths in draft form are available for public comment, but I'm assured by my colleagues in Canberra that they will be available for public view and public comment well before the airport opens in 2026, as you would expect, and that those comments will be taken very, very seriously, because we don't want to create an airport that causes problems for people. We don't want to repeat the mistakes that have occurred over many years with Sydney Airport. We want to minimise the downside. Now, can I say there won't be noise out of an airport? Of course I can't. There will be. Our task is to minimise that and to be the best corporate citizen that we can be, and to maximise the benefits that an airport development brings.
Great. And before we wrap up, is there any final comments from anyone on the panel? Anything that, any questions I forgot to ask you?
I think you covered them all.
Covered? Good. Great. Well, I'd like to say thank you to our fabulous panel. Thank you.